Okay, guys, welcome back. English 101. We are heading into the sort of final section of the semester here. We're barreling along with David Foster Wallace. We're already on page 4 of 6. So I don't have a whole lot to say other than I think we're just going to jump back into David Foster Wallace. Um, Again, I hope you've spent some time thinking about, your beliefs on whether it's okay to eat animals. Um, and I hope it's not just, it's fine, animals eat animals, so I can eat animals. You need to kind of think about it. You need to kind of consider objections. What would someone that disagreed with eating animals say? And then what would you say to respond to them? Like, why is it okay if you eat animals? And to think about these questions, because you're going to have a hard time with this essay if you haven't, like, what you need. Here's the thing, most people, they believe things. Whatever they believe, oh, I think, God controls all the good stuff in the, all, God is in charge of the universe and has a plan for my life, or they'll be like, evolution is real, or whatever they think. But most people just sort of have these beliefs, but they don't. One of the things this class forces you to do is you have to say, for what reason do you believe this? So most people go, I believe blah blah blah. You have to go, I believe blah, 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 because. And then you have to have a reason. It would be good if you had more than one reason. I believe in blah, 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 and here's one reason, here's another reason, here's a third reason. Um, and then provide examples so that each one of those reasons has some examples to go with it. For example, this, for example, that. Most people will just believe things without thinking about why. They don't know why. Um, which is how you get into weird situations sometimes. If anybody brings up sort of complex philosophical problems, you'd be surprised how many people are like just not ready to deal with it. So, for example, my mother will say like, God is good, and He controls everything in the world to lead it towards a good outcome. And then I go, Mom, how come all these people over here got murdered? And it's like a tough thing to answer if you believe that God is good and God has a plan for the world and only and that He's guiding it toward a sort of conclusion. Then it becomes hard to explain if God's kind of in charge of everything, why God's allowing murder. So you have to think about that. Someone that objected to your claim, though, right, would be like, hey, what about all the murder and violence and terribleness in the world? So obviously, I don't need you to think about that particular question. My point is that a lot of people believe things, um, but you're going to have to kind of think it through. You're going to have to imagine what someone that objected to your belief would say and what you would say in response to them. Okay, cool. Let's keep going with David Foster Wallace and see where we can get today. Maybe we can wrap up David Foster Wallace today. That would be very exciting if we could do that. So David Foster Wallace has been talking about animals, particularly lobster. His example, he's talking about whether it's okay to eat animals and why. What kind of reasons do people give? And his example is the lobster. Now, the lobster is an interesting example because it's the kind of thing that a lot of people, because it doesn't show emotions, for a couple of reasons. He likes the lobster as an example because number one, you can't see emotions on lobsters. They don't. It doesn't scream when you put it in water. We don't. It doesn't seem friendly. It's like this weird alien looking thing with a hard shell and claws. It doesn't have facial expressions. You can tell if a puppy is happy because it wags its tail, but you can't tell if a lobster is happy. So, the lobster is an interesting example because most people are like, yeah, I'm definitely can eat that. That thing doesn't, is a totally bizarre creature. It's nothing like me. Right? You would need a person because they're like you, and so you would be able to imagine because you don't want to get eaten, you probably wouldn't eat somebody else. But with a lobster, it's not like you. It's actually very different from you. A dog is a little bit like you, but a lobster is not much like you at all. And so David Foster Wallace decides to investigate the lobster, but it's really just an example. He raises a bunch of issues with lobsters, but of course you should think about them for all kinds of animals. You should think about it for chickens and fish and pork and beef and all these kinds of things. So, okay, let's keep going with this. Oh, the other thing I did, last time I mentioned, he mentioned several things in order to think about animals feeling pain. He says it raises all kinds of issues. He says it raises issues having to do with metaphysics, with value, sort of value judgments. What does he say? I gotta look it up now. But he mentions metaphysics. Oh man, I really wanted to talk to you guys about this, and I find that I don't even know where it is. Um, I'm finding it. Give me a second. You'd wait if I was in class. Um, Metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, and ethics. That's from the bottom of page 2. He says it involves metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, and ethics. And I gave you guys a definition of those terms pretty quickly yesterday. Ethics is knowing what's right from what's wrong. Is the study of, what is the ethical thing to do? In other words, what is the moral thing to do? Definitions of right and wrong. That was an easy one. Value theory has to do with what do you value more than other things. Do you believe human beings are more valuable than animals, for example? That's value theory. What do you value? What do you not value? Epistemology, I said, is how do you know what you know? So, for example, if you kick your dog and your dog yelps in pain, you're going to say that dog is in pain. But how do you know? Is that enough? Just because the animal yelps and acts hurt, does that prove the animal feels pain? How do you know? You're not doing a brain scan, right? You're just kind of guessing from this sort of what's going on the outside. So epistemology has to do with how do you know what's going on in another creature's mind? Because, for example, pain. You can't feel someone else's pain. So it raises questions of epistemology. How do you know they're in pain? Well, they're acting like they're in pain. Well, are they pretending like they're in pain? The last one was metaphysics, and I didn't give a very good definition of metaphysics, and so I wanted to correct that here. Metaphysics has to do with sort of major philosophical stuff. The major example of metaphysics I would give is what is the relationship between the mind and the world. So here's a perfectly good metaphysical question. Does the world exist if no one is looking at it? How do you know the world isn't just a giant illusion? How do you know that you're not like the only living creature in the world, and everybody else, there's like wires plugged in your brain somewhere making you think you live in the real world? That's a metaphysical question. Metaphysics has to do with the relationship between the reality and the mind. So for David Foster Wallace's thing, he's bringing up metaphysics because it has to do with how do you know animals are even real like you are? You know your own mind, but how do you know the things outside your mind are real? For example, animal pain. All right, so I think I wanted to go back and do that. All right, pretty good. Okay, I think that's about all I got to do for the beginning. So let's just get started on this. I've only got a couple minutes before I go into the next video, but we've gotten started. So I'm on page 4. He says, still, after all the abstract intellection, meaning all of this sort of philosophy thinking, abstract here is being used in an unusual way, but abstract really means like big philosophy things like justice and goodness and pain. But there's abstract, but he wants to. The opposite of abstract is concrete. So, like, to have a philosophical conversation about pain as to what is pain and how do we know other people feel it. To get concrete is to kick a dog. So he says, let something specific, a very specific example. So he says, after all the abstract intellection, there remains the facts of the frantically clanking lid, the pathetic clinging to the edge of the pot, right? The lobster doesn't want to be cooked. It's acting like it doesn't want to be cooked. Of course, we don't know what's going on in the lobster's mind, but it is acting like it doesn't want to be cooked. It's doing what you and I would do if somebody tried to put us in a pot of water. We would try to get the lid off. We would try to cling to the edge of the pot and not get thrown in. Standing at the stove, it's hard to deny in any meaningful way that this is a living creature experiencing pain and wishing to escape the painful experience. To my lay mind, the word lay there means unprofessional. So he's not a biologist or an expert on lobsters. He's just a regular lay mind means just my regular brain, not an expert brain. To my lay mind, the lobster's behavior in the kettle appears to be the expression of a preference, right? It would rather not be killed. And it may well be that an ability to form preferences is the decisive criterion, meaning the ultimate test for real suffering. Right? The issue here is he says, look, you can tell that lobster does not want to go into the pot of boiling water. It would rather not do that. And in ethics, you might want to think about if something has preferences, maybe those preferences should be respected. I don't think a rock has a preference. I don't think the rock would like you could take a rock and you kick it. I don't think the rock cares. The rock doesn't have preferences. The rock doesn't know you're kicking it. And so the rock has no preferences at all. And people imagine animals are like that. They don't care. We're going to eat them. But the lobster clearly experiences preferences. It doesn't want to go in the pot of water. And he thinks that he's thinking the one of the ways we can tell that we shouldn't hurt animals is they clearly have preferences. They have things they'd rather be doing, and we are putting our preferences above their preferences. That's value theory because we value our preferences. I want a tasty food more than their preferences. Don't kill me.